Good morning to everyone, and welcome back to Roosevelt House. I was asked to do a summary of yesterday's discussion, and that is a daunting, if not impossible, task. But I will share with you what I thought were some of the themes that came out in the very thoughtful discussions that took place. So we began in our first panel with an historical overview of human rights philanthropy. And in the telling of that history, I think it emerged that several strategic decisions were made early on, which really shaped the human rights movement as we know it today. One of those, clearly indicated by R.A. Nyer in his discussion with Gara LaMarche, was a decision not to integrate economic and social rights, but rather to focus on civil and political rights. Another, perhaps not so much an intentional decision, was to build strong and large organizations, largely in the global north, that took on a global role in creating new institutions, such as the International Criminal Court, and in developing and utilizing UN mechanisms. In yesterday afternoon's panel, these accomplishments were discussed more critically, and a concern raised in various ways that the human rights movement, as we know it, is disproportionately funded in the global north. Perhaps it is also a bit disconnected from other movements that have emerged calling for social justice, but not necessarily using the terminology, the language, and/or techniques, which are largely legal and UN-based, that have been so well developed by the human rights movement. As I saw from last night's news, which included a review of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of aggression in Ukraine, it is clear to me that the advances in international criminal justice have significantly changed the dynamics of the political dialogue on accountability. That is certainly to the credit of the human rights movement and the human rights philanthropists who played such an active role in supporting the international criminal courts. On the other hand, there was some suggestion yesterday that this may or may not reflect the priorities of those on the front lines, including survivors. Throughout the day, there was a repeated sense of longing, I think, and perhaps even commitment to expanding the human rights movement, both in terms of getting more support to more groups in more countries, and also in terms of embracing issues that have not historically been at the core of the human rights movement. The High Commissioner for Human Rights indicated her strong conviction that human rights is central to a wide range of issues, naming climate change and COVID as well as armed conflict. In subsequent discussion, it was suggested that the human rights framework may be the best or even the only framework that gives some coherence to these efforts. And yesterday evening, we heard a spirited debate over this tension between the universality of individual human rights and the focus on identity that some groups have mobilized around, groups such as Me Too or Black Lives Matter. I think in the end it was agreed that this is not necessarily an inherent tension, but perhaps a reaction to the historic inequality which has been manifest in the way marginalized or less powerful groups and human rights violations against them have been treated. The stark contrast was drawn, for example, between the treatment of Ukrainian versus Haitian refugees, or even refugees crossing the border from Ukraine who are not white. Now today, we'll look at change and new directions and at the role of human rights philanthropy in shaping the future of the human rights movement. I think we seesawed yesterday between hope and despair, but we kept coming back to hope, and today let's try to turn that hope into more specific ideas. We're delighted to have Kizito Bienka with us to chair the third panel of this conference. Kizito is the Director of Campaigns at the Open Society Foundations, and in this role, he is leading Open Society Campaigns, a new method to organize and accelerate impact on advocacy. Kizito has been one of the organizers of this conference, and I want to thank him for all of his help and for chairing this panel on how philanthropy can address emerging human rights issues. So please welcome Kizito Bienka, who will introduce the other members of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica, and it's a pleasure to be with you all here today. So we're here to have a great discussion on what are the emerging issues that the human rights field, human rights philanthropy should be addressing. So our environment now is one of real risk. From all the discussions that we've had over the course of yesterday, we've raised a number of important flags that we need to be able to address. Even before the pandemic, low and middle income countries around the world were facing a debt crisis. The pandemic has ushered in the first rise in global poverty in more than 2 decades. Inflation and unemployment have risen sharply. Food and fuel prices have soared, and there are serious concerns on global growth, with signs indicating towards a global recession. supply chains are likely to become shorter and more regionalized, potentially harming trade cooperation and global exchange of food, technology, goods, information, people, and cultures. Coupled with the climate crisis, we're facing a range of challenges. We're also facing heightened nationalism, an emerging economic crisis, and emergency powers and restrictions from the pandemic, accompanied by a new global focus on national security issues in which human rights and democracy concerns have been sidelined even more. Rights have also moved online, where we are seeing increasing technological repression through digital surveillance, restrictions to assembly and expression online, via internet shutdowns, and it's important to be able to expand our field and understanding of human rights beyond the physical space that we've been in for a long time to what will be happening in the new online space. The infrastructure, that supports the advancement and enforcement of rights has also been severely undermined. Key multilateral fora have suffered authoritarian capture. We see that now with the Ukraine crisis and what's ahead. So beyond just the environment where human rights takes place and where our work is centered, the institutions, the platforms that drive that enforcement, that drive the work that we do, and provide the avenues for us to take forward our solutions are also weakened. So where are we going? How can philanthropy address emerging human rights issues in this environment? How can we make philanthropy inclusive of issues that have not traditionally been viewed as human rights, for example, climate change or economic inequality? How can we ensure that the traditional priorities of the human rights movement are not abandoned as the scope of the movement expands? How can we encourage other philanthropists and advocates to use the human rights framework for their work? So this panel will explore those issues. We'll be touching on a range of themes. Hopefully we'll get through them all, from the Ukraine crisis to the pandemic, to technological repression, to authoritarianism, and to climate change. We'll try to go through a number of questions, but we'll also open it up to the audience for questions that you have on all these burning topics. We'll try to keep it as easy as possible as a conversation, so we all get informed on what we need to do and what we need to take forward. We'll first start with Kalia, who will provide a great example from what the Human Rights Funders Network has been doing in terms of monitoring the trends and analysis of the human rights framework and the impact now in terms of the emerging issues that we need to address, and then go on for the conversation. But first, let me introduce our panelists. And so starting with Kalia, Dr. Kalia Miller has led research, grant making, and strategy development at feminist and human rights foundations, including the Global Fund for Women, Australia Lesbian Foundation for Justice, Mama Cash, UNIFEM, UN Women. Her academic research explores how accountability and power shape funding in multilateral institutions. She's currently the Deputy Executive Director for the Human Rights Funders Network. The next is Reagan Ralph, who is the founding president and CEO of the Fund for Global Human Rights. As a young women's rights advocate, she embraced the power of human rights to challenge structural inequality and has worked alongside and in support of human rights movements ever since. Since its founding 20 years ago, the fund has delivered over $120 million in financial support to local organizations and human rights advocates all over the world. Mona Sinha is a globally recognized advocate for gender equality in business and society. She's currently the board chair of Women Moving Millions, a community of women who fund big and bold, over $1 million, to create a gender equal world. Mona is also the co-founder of Raising Change, which develops strategies to close the critical funding gap in mission-driven organizations for social change. Mona received the Impact Award for Philanthropic Leadership from CARE USA in 2021. And then Duncan Wilson has been Executive Director of the Sigrid Rousing Trust since 2019. He has over 20 years of experience in the human rights field with the Open Society Foundations, the Scottish Human Rights Commission, Amnesty International, and the United Nations. Please give a round of applause for our esteemed panelists. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Things got a little fiery last night. I enjoyed the debate, and I wanted to demystify some of what we've been talking about. I believe very strongly in no stories without numbers and no numbers without stories. So here are the numbers to the stories we've been telling about the history and the future of human rights grant making. This conversation is framed by some of the things that I heard yesterday, and you'll hear on our panel, all of us went home and redid our notes after the sessions we heard. So the questions that I want to try to address slightly here are whether the framework of human rights is still relevant, what it means to fund in an ecosystem, and the question of universality versus intersectionality. Maybe it doesn't have to be a versus, and maybe it does. Very briefly, at HRFN, we have been doing research mapping the full landscape of funding for human rights for the last decade. We analyze grant-level data, and I say this because we are not just looking at people that define themselves as human rights funders. We are looking at every grant. We are assessing it based on whether or not the type of work fits within what we have defined as the framework of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's important because we're not looking for people who say they fund human rights or do human rights work. We are looking at the type of work, the type of organization. And you can learn more about our methodology on our website. We'll get into the numbers for today. Some of the key takeaways is that human rights funding is indeed increasing. Over the last decade of our research, we have gone from $1.7 billion in annual giving for human rights to our most recent number, which is $3.7 billion. It seems quite hopeful when you just say the number without context. The context is that somewhere between 2 and 7% of all foundation funding goes to human rights issues. When you think about that and slice it down by issue or population, for example, women's rights, where there's so much rhetoric about funding for gender equality, that means that just somewhere around 0.5% of all foundation funding is going to women's rights. Let's just hold that for a minute. Compare that to the rhetoric that we hear. The funding is not matching that reality of rhetoric. This is even the case in contexts where we would expect to see more human rights funding. For instance, in the recent flurry of investments in Ukraine, just 5% of the dollars and 2% of the number of grants reflected any commitment to human rights. Now, these numbers are changing. There are a lot of feminist foundations, human rights foundations who are making small grants. But it's important to note that at that beginning, when we did this initial analysis, not a single one of the grants talked about, for instance, racial justice. We've already addressed why that is an issue. We'll get more into that today. The second thing I want to address is funding in an ecosystem. I recognize that these are small, maybe bigger on the screen, but small for those of you at home. Work that I've done with AWID has tried to move from just looking at funding delivered to feminist movements or to human rights movements into understanding human rights funding as part of an ecosystem that can influence larger flows of funding, but also can be part of sometimes capturing money that could directly reach movements. We will talk about this more today, and you will hear it in my remarks, but understanding our role in that funding ecosystem is so much more important for understanding how we can change human rights issues and how we can support movements than just our funding alone. We need to look, as I started to raise yesterday, at questions of direct funding, where there is potential funding that could reach our movements, but also the funding against human rights. When we look at the ecosystem, one thing that becomes very clear when we get to the numbers is that we have a high concentration of a smaller number of foundations. As you can see, the top 12 human rights funders accounted for 45% of the grants in our latest analysis. I don't mean to say you should fund less. We're very happy for that amount of funding, but it does create questions about the power that we hold in setting agendas. There's also a lot of hope that we see at HRFN at Global South and East funding models. We see quite a few, especially feminist and women's funds, who are funding within their regions and who have proliferated over, certainly since some of the history that we heard yesterday. There's a new form of funding that we also need to take into account when we're trying to do the local constituency-based funding that we all spoke of yesterday. I wish I could go into this more right now. I will at some point offer to if you want to, but there is a trust gap. Absolutely clearly in our data, we are finding that when grants are made outside of the global north, they are more restricted, they are very often less direct. So if you are based in sub-Saharan Africa, only 1/3 of the grants are directly going to your organization. The remaining 2/3 goes to organizations based outside of the region. So even if you're working, let's say you're working in Southern Africa, you're from Southern Africa, the chances of you getting a direct grant are much less than the chances of you getting a grant that's gone to a group in, say, the Netherlands who cares about Africa. This is a real issue when we're talking about the role that philanthropy can play in directly and meaningfully supporting constituency-led advocacy. The last question is around intersectionality. We were asked last night if human rights frameworks were universal. What we find when we dig into the numbers is that without naming specific communities or populations, human rights work often fails to reach those on the margins. We are doing some analysis that will come out in the next few months, but in our initial glance at this, what we found is that just 18% of all grants identified at least 2 populations they were supporting. This doesn't mean they checked the boxes. This is reading the grant descriptions, understanding what that grant was going for. What does that mean? Let's take racial justice, for instance. When we have a colorblind approach to funding, it often means we are not supporting Black-led organizing. It often means that we are ascribing a generality that isn't happening in practice. With COVID, we know that we cannot continue to take a race-free look at health, at other human rights issues, and yet that's what's happened in our funding. When you slice it down even further, it gets more troubling. Funding for Black women and girls and gender non-conforming people is just 5% of all human rights funding. Again, take that in the context of all funding, and it gets, I think it's 0.38%. There's some great research that others have done on this. PRE is an example, and you can see the issue of intersectionality. Intersectional funding, as distinct from inclusive funding, is where we see a continual decline. That means our funding is not matching the reality of movements which are indeed organizing intersectionally. I know this is a lot of information. I'm happy to share this later. Like I said, this is the numbers part. We'll get to the stories. What has this meant for Human Rights Funders Network? First and foremost, we have just launched a new strategy. The overarching framework is something we're calling open philanthropy. If you just sit with that phrase for a minute, it might scare you. It scares us a little bit. But the idea is, what does it mean for us actually to fund in ways that are movement-centered? We also, because of the analysis that I just described, have identified priority areas: intersectionality, racial justice, human rights defenders and closing civic space, a global funding ecosystem, and climate justice. We see these as the key areas where our field has the potential to make significant change in the next 5 years with the right attention. I'm going to leave you with an intentionally provocative quote. This comes from Vanessa Daniel, who is the executive director of Groundswell Fund. This came out of a conversation about the role of power in philanthropy, and I feel like power was missing from a lot of the conversation yesterday, though started to come up as we got further into it. And I'm just going to read it out, and with that I'll leave this as an entry point for our conversation, so I'll leave it for our panelists to deal with it. There is a weird way in which power operates among white leaders in philanthropy, because it's a paradox. On the one hand, there's quite a bit of power and the exercising of it. But there's this sort of fragility when it comes to exercising power in the direction of structural change in our sector, where you have folks that are sitting right next to the levers of incredible resources and decision-making power and could transform it, and feel kind of impotent or somehow unable to use it or make a decision not to use it. I think that folks need to step up to use it and start using it and getting comfortable with discomfort. Thank you.
Thank you, Kalia. So getting comfortable with discomfort. Great line to end with. And so, picking up on what you're sharing around power and some of your presentation, if you think about us, our role as philanthropists, there's a limited number to what you shared, 12, that corner the human rights funding arena. So, in terms of supporting around 50% of all funding towards human rights. So to your point around power, there's great power in how we set our priorities and how we think about our action on these emerging issues and how we address them, because our moves will shape how the actions will be done on these issues throughout the world. And one of those issues that's burning, that we addressed and touched on a little bit yesterday, but we want to expand further today, is on the crisis in Ukraine. That's the moment that we find ourselves in now, and how we respond and what the ramifications will be from that will be lasting. So, looking at the Ukraine, the fallout from that crisis will reshape the global power balance and drive sweeping economic, social, and political changes. If you take one aspect of that, Russia and Ukraine are major suppliers of energy, food, and minerals. Between them, they supply a quarter of all traded wheat, and the World Food Program, which feeds some 88 million people a year, receives half of its wheat supply from Ukraine. The rights challenges that are implicated with food insecurity are on the horizon. We all remember how the shifts with the price of bread led to massive and sweeping changes more than a decade ago, catalyzing the Arab Spring and other social protests and civil unrest. So Duncan, given how Ukraine has the potential and is showing how it's a systems-breaking conflict with global ramifications, Russia's acts of aggression follow years of warfare by proxy from countries from the Central African Republic to Myanmar, and through sustained attacks on international norms and laws, on democracy and human rights. How should philanthropy respond to this crisis?
Thanks very much. I'll give some reflections based on our own experience, and of course, what I'll say reflects the place of Sigrid Rising Trust, the foundation that I work in, within the funding ecosystem. And just to situate that, it's a 27-year-old foundation based in the UK that with a current annual grant-making budget of just over £40 million, and an important change in just a few years ago was the trust moving from a global funder working in about 55 countries to much more of a regionally focused funder with our priority regions, including Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. So when this crisis began, I think the first thing that I would reflect on the response was what preparation we had taken, or what preparatory steps were there. And yesterday, I think it was Gara who said it's important to support the human rights movement not only in times of crisis, and that's very much been part of the DNA of the Sigrid Rising Trust's approach of supporting organizations and demonstrating fidelity to those organizations with a long-term, unrestricted funding model. So when this happened, we were supporting about 10 organizations in Ukraine, and the type of support, of course, was unrestricted, which meant that at least two groups that I know of were able to use those funds to do things like purchase minivans to help their staff escape to Western Ukraine, rent alternative office space that they could move to from Kyiv during the invasion. So the steps that were taken beforehand, I think, are relevant to thinking about the response as well. The second step, of course, is the immediate response, the emergency funding that followed. And glibly, I think the the answer to your question, what should we be doing, is act quickly and well. Being a smaller foundation helps in some ways to act quickly. We have a very engaged chair who is our founder and funder, and who made clear right at the beginning, on the day of the invasion, that this was the priority for the foundation, and that additional funding would be made available to address that. And having just gone through the COVID pandemic and an emergency response there, despite being, a long-term funder with a model that is premised on thoughtful identification of grantees and relatively predictable schedules of renewals, and essentially, for the most part, a 10-year arc in funding, we had learned some things about emergency response that we could put into practice more quickly, I would say, than we managed to do with COVID. The first grants that we made, unsurprisingly perhaps, were to women's funds, partners that we knew well and that were able to quickly distribute funding to grassroots groups, either providing direct humanitarian assistance, which of course agencies, UN agencies and others were not, and in some cases are still not in Ukraine, or supporting relocation of human rights defenders at risk. The second step on the same day of the invasion was to reach out to all of our grantees and ask them what additional support they might need. And then to quickly refresh or rip up many of our existing processes, to take things down to the bare minimum in terms of requirements, to be brutally realistic about what we can expect of organizations in a context like that, and to really embrace risk in our grant making in a way that we often as funders talk about but rarely actually do, and recognize that we had to stand by the principle of trust-based grant making more than ever in a moment like that. So with longer-term partners, with any of our existing grantees, really all we needed was an understanding of what the needs were and roughly what the funding would be used for. And with new organizations that we have supported, and we've now given around 25 grants and soon to be over £2 million in the last 5 weeks, a reference from a trusted source. So recognizing that that kind of grant making, which is often just a short email from a program officer outlining those things, is very risky, and that our board stood by us, and one of our board members, Hosh, is here, and very helpfully recognized that it was the right moment to embrace risk, and we would look back in 12 months' time, and some of those risks would have been realized, and that was okay.
Great, thank you for that, Duncan.
Sorry,
Please go ahead.
Can I move on to? Sorry, I didn't want to stop without mentioning the next steps and the wider implications. So, looking ahead, I think we are now faced with a new set of questions, which is how far we want to engage in, and we're prepared to engage in, supporting rebuilding of civil society organizations that have been decimated, supporting the reestablishment of organizations at times in exile, dealing with our distaste often as funders for supporting diaspora-based organizations, and applying that in a realistic way in this context, looking at the knock-on impacts of this conflict in Central Asia and the Caucasus, for example. An International Alert published a very useful 5-point risk analysis. The economic impacts of the loss of remittances from Russia in Central Asia being one, the risk of the inflammation of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict being another. Thinking about how far we want to move beyond the narrower parameters of transitional justice frame to embrace peace building in those contexts. Not ignoring other issues and places as we prioritize the crisis, and trying to capitalize on some of the precedents set in the response to Ukraine to make sure that the EU's approach to migration and refugee rights in this crisis is the new benchmark or watermark for future crises and is not an aberration. And finally, I think, thinking about the implications for our staff, as we ask them to respond very quickly, giving them an unlimited budget, essentially, to do that at the same time as keeping the rest of the work going. And I think there's a responsibility to also think about their welfare.
Great, thank you, Duncan. And it's heartening to hear that blueprint and how the trust has outlined the vision and what needs to be done to be able to address the crisis. What I also take away from what you've shared is preparation. You know, you were able to react and respond quickly, you know, with the example you gave around unrestricted funding, where the organizations were able to address the emergent needs as quickly as possible. That speaks to the infrastructure of funding and how philanthropy is arranging that to be able to address these crises when they do occur. Also in prioritization and how you outlined that menu of options and how your foundation ripped up existing plans to be able to focus and address the issue now, but also how that will last and go forward with the other areas that need to be addressed. To your point, we should not forget other crises, but understand how this is implicating all. And so coming to you, Reagan, on that point, you know, because Ukraine is happening in a wider context. You know, in 2020, global debt surged to 226 trillion, the largest one-year increase since World War II. Inflation, food, and fuel prices are on the rise. If you take Duncan's point on acting quickly and well, how and where do we uplift rights when many are concerned about livelihoods? You know, how about the trade-offs? Is it human rights versus well-being and security?
Thank you for the question, Kizito, and thank you for organizing this conversation. I appreciate the opportunity to be talking about current challenges with the benefit of having thought about the history of what has brought us to this conversation today, because I think the truth of the matter is philanthropy has learned and pivoted over the years, and the creation of my organization is one example of that. 20 years ago, we started thinking about how to deliver more resources to on-the-ground human rights activists with the support of many people in this room. Thank you very much. And that enabled us to broaden the lens, to understand how to answer these questions, not because we're coming up with the answers, but because we're listening to the advocates on the ground who are thinking about this all the time. And so that's the basis for how I think about the question you've just asked and why I say that I think it's a false dichotomy. I mean, I think that the conversation yesterday was bringing us to the point of saying there's a reason that people gathered in rooms like this one talk about rights versus economic well-being. But in reality, most people for whom the human rights model and the human rights idea is a powerful mobilizing and political organizing force are people who are looking to create well-being and security for their communities. And so it's actually a path into human rights, not something that is in tension with human rights. And just to give a couple of examples of that, I visited many years ago a group in Guatemala that was working on food sovereignty, not food security, but food sovereignty. The point being that they were looking to control how they planted and what they planted and whether they could sustain their communities in times of drought or, weather adversity, because what had happened in Guatemala was that Monsanto had taken over all of the planting and it was a single crop country. And so if there was a bad year, you didn't get the flowers to sell to North America and you can't feed your kids on the flowers that you're growing. And so they were looking to take back control of agriculture in their country as using a rights approach as a way of advancing the interests of their community. Similarly, we support a Garifuna organization in Honduras that is all about economic security. The name of the organization is Ofrene, for those of you who might know it, and they are all about mobilizing their community to think about their right to economic well-being, the right to security of their communities. So, and then on the flip side, you have a government like that in Russia, which shows, again, the sort of false promise of security. This idea that if you exchange your personal rights, you can actually enjoy security, when in fact, obviously, that's not what people in Russia are experiencing. And now the whole world has been disrupted by the fact that there is an authoritarian ruler whom nobody can hold accountable. And a part of the reason that it's so difficult to hold Putin and his administration accountable is because he has systematically dismantled and destroyed civil society and the independent media in his country. And so when I think about what the answers are to situations like this, I think that the investments in the global human rights conversation and the global human rights organizations is fundamentally important, and they will be resources and important partners as we take on the challenges that you have ambitiously set out for us to discuss today. But if we don't have robust civil societies in these different countries, we actually, at the end of the day, don't have any way to hold wayward governments accountable. And I think that's where the investment, not just in the moment, and yes, we do need to be able to be adaptive and pivot and respond to emergencies. And we need to fund our grantees in a way that allows them to do that as well. But we also need to be thinking about the long term and how you invest in building civil societies that can themselves play a part in meeting these challenges.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that, Regan. And that's excellent on the point of the infrastructure that needs to be there, the robust civil society, the systems in place to be able to respond at that local level to these crises, but not just in this moment now, in the long term. And so touching base on what you shared around food sovereignty and the great examples you gave of your partner organizations and how they developed their work around this, just expanding a little bit, because food insecurity during the pandemic rose to around 3 billion people. More is expected on the horizon, given what we shared earlier in terms of Ukraine's role in exporting wheat. So what needs to be done to safeguard rights with the urgent needs in navigating this economic recovery? Kelly, if I could come to you for this one.
Great. I picked up that microphone like I knew you were coming to me. I've never seen these questions before. I think that Regan really touched on some of the key elements that are necessary for us to address this issue. And although I just described the importance of not requiring people to use the term human rights, I feel like for economic recovery, a human rights framework is absolutely essential. We know that if women have access to reproductive rights, we know that if women have access to education, that it impacts who is fed in their home, it impacts who is fed in their community, and it impacts food security. Those experiences and those rights are inextricable when we think about food security. It is not just a matter of getting food to the right places. And I think perhaps more than any issue, food security and the ability to survive through these kinds of moments is so indicative of the need and the difference when you have a human rights framework. And I think what Regan just shared illustrated that beautifully. The other piece, something that has been coming up throughout the course of this conversation, is around equity. And I think especially around the role that human rights philanthropy can play is not to just look at the macroeconomic issues, but for us to take very strategic, very specific, and very targeted approaches to ensuring that those on the margins are able to secure their rights and able to mobilize in ways that we cannot do if we do not take an equity lens. And I think both within Ukraine, but also even within COVID, we have seen when communities are able to mobilize, for instance, in mutual aid forms, they are taking an intersectional approach that often our funding fails to match. And I think as we're talking about recovery, having an equity lens is key. And then the third piece is not just an equity lens now, but is in recognizing our role, again, in the ecosystem. And I will keep coming back to this because I think sometimes we overstate our power and understate our possibilities. We have a unique role to play in economic recovery in that long-term sustained support for civil society, by taking an economic justice approach to our funding, but to do that within an understanding that there are other people who are doing the humanitarian responses. We need to understand what they're doing so that we're not replicating it, but come in those strategic pivot points. I'll stop there.
Fantastic, thanks for sharing that. So I'm seeing a line through in terms of the strategy, action and the how, the infrastructure, and then the framework that underpins that, the actions and the goals and how we take that forward. And you mentioned an interesting and important point around how rights are inextricable, to your point on equity as well as your point on intersectionality. Duncan mentioned that when they first started supporting the urgent response in Ukraine, they started to support women's funds because that was what they prioritized. And to your point around women's rights being inextricable from the crisis and how we've been describing this. So Mona, Ukraine, like all conflicts, will hit women and girls the hardest. What are the rights implications?
So I speak on behalf of Women Moving Millions. We're a small group of passionate women who fund gender equality with a minimum threshold of $1 million. And many people are not aware, to date we've put about over $1 billion into this ecosystem. So what we see often or every time in a war zone is women are often the disregarded results of what goes on, the damages of war. And it's no different in Ukraine because, first of all, no one acknowledges that many young women, all untrained, have taken up arms to defend Ukraine. You know, we hear the stories of the men and boys staying behind, but we see many young women being killed right in the front lines defending their country. So I think those stories need to be amplified. The second thing is we see women and children crossing over in big numbers, as we're all aware of. But what underlines that? Of course, there's the basic needs of food and shelter and clothing and all of that. But think about the women who've lost their livelihoods and their economic security in making this transition over. Where are these women going to find their jobs and take care of their children? This is a common thread we've seen during COVID as well. There is no safety net in terms of a care economy or in terms of guaranteeing that they're able to get back on their feet, because many of them are not going to have the networks that they're used to, of family or of society or friends or anything that keeps them sane, frankly, in managing all of these things. And the third thing I'll highlight is it's really important to think about rebuilding, and we've heard that in this conversation, but let's also focus on mental health, because that's, again, a thread that emerged very clearly during the pandemic, and the burden of care falls upon women, whether we like it or not, and as good as our partners may be. But we really need to safeguard the health and prioritize the economic security of women to allow their societies to rebuild and thrive. And even as they are displaced and move across the world, how do you hold that cultural fluency that is so important to identity? And I think that was a conversation that was missing in some of yesterday's talks that we heard, is how do you hold on to culture as an important part of your identity and rebuilding community when you're not even in the place that allows you to do that?
Fantastic. Thank you, Mona. Thank you all for raising the important issues that we should be addressing as philanthropy with this emerging crisis. Let me just turn to the audience. If you might have any questions, to raise to our panelists around this issue. Doug?
Thank you, Doug Rutson from ICNL, an excellent panel. Kizito, I'd like to elevate an issue that you highlighted in your opening remarks, which is, as we look to the future, the issue of digital technology. That we're seeing that digital technology has reduced the cost of repression. In the past, if you wanted to spy on a dissident, you'd have to pay the salary of a security officer who might fall asleep or miss something. Now, the cost is really low. You need CCTV and an algorithm. We have the commoditization of personal data, so surveillance capitalism. The question, to what extent do you think that philanthropy can play a role in ensuring that there's actual civic participation in digital decision-making, recognizing that many of us come from a legal background or a social science background, and it's hard for us often to speak tech, engage on issues. What's a neural network? What's the difference between machine learning, artificial intelligence, and so forth? Thanks.
Okay, there we go. Cutting right to the hardest questions, as always. Just a couple of reflections, because I'm definitely one of those people who doesn't speak tech with great comfort. But What I will say is that you're right. It's very clear that authoritarian, but not only authoritarian governments are using digital technology to surveil, censor, harass, and otherwise create problems for activism and activists. And I think there is actually a critical role for philanthropy to play in responding to that. The first is enabling organizations to be aware of what the tools are that are arrayed against them, and then be proactively prepared for that. And we've actually been working with a number of our grantees in Latin America and South Asia to do digital security assessments and put in place the ability on their staff to keep them current with what's going on. But I think that's the bare minimum, is getting people to the point where they understand and can protect themselves. There's also, and I think this is implied in your question, the importance of advocacy and changing the paradigms within which this is happening. And again, I see organizations that are interested in monitoring what governments are doing and creating regulatory frameworks that make it much more difficult, theoretically, if you have people to monitor and enforce, the ability of governments to deploy technology to create issues for civil society. And I think the goal is to create better regulation, to collaborate between groups in different parts of the world to make sure that companies, because these companies operate globally, as we know from the whole Pegasus conversation, to make sure that they're not getting away with in one place what they've been stopped from doing someplace else. And to expose and to use the documentation tools that many human rights organizations have to expose what governments are doing and how they're doing it, which has been done really effectively, for example, in a place like Mexico. And that has surfaced the problems that these practices raise. Now we just have to provide the funding to help them be able to follow those things to some sort of the creation of some sort of scheme that makes it possible for those things to be brought to light and not to sit behind closed doors.
So I could add to that. I mean, obviously, we're seeing cybersecurity as being a huge issue, right? And that's something that needs to be highlighted as we do our work in terms of making sure that women are safe. I talk mostly about women, but societies are safe. We have seen the rise of digital pornography, for example, which is very harmful. We have seen how the digital world has helped in trafficking across the world, where people are more connected. So even to raise awareness of these issues is really important, because young people can be lured into these worlds, where they think they are seen and heard and belong, but they don't. It's dangerous. And the other thing I will say is the construction of these universes needs to have a gender lens. So when women are involved in creating these digital platforms, right, and having a voice in how they're actually constructed, that makes a huge difference, because we look at it with the lens of safety. If you look at what's going on right now with Web3 and the metaverse, only 16% of women are involved in this, in the creation of what could be the next huge breakthrough in the digital world. And that's got to change. So there's sometimes a fear factor of, oh, I don't understand. Well, I think what we need to do is encourage people, and we can certainly do that through giving them resources to learn about it, to say you have a voice in shaping and creating this new narrative for the future. And I think that's another important piece of it.
So just to say, Doug, you raised a great topic that we're going to get dug into a little bit more here in terms of rights within the online space, technological repression, and we've raised a few items here. Kalia, what would you like to add?
Yeah, I think that a lot has been covered. I want to say very concisely, there are a few things we must do as funders. One is to practice what we preach. We can all talk about supporting digital security, but I've worked in enough foundations to know we often don't do it well ourselves. We need to fund the work, so provide funds and be explicit that our funding can be used for and may, in fact, need to be used in some cases for digital security, and prepare with our grantees and our partners, including these in our risk assessments. We need to work for a free and open web, and I've thought a lot recently about places where we're uncomfortable intellectually, and I think this is one of those. Technology is mystical. It happens in that sort of Wizard of Oz space, and suddenly you have it before you. And for us to actually understand how it works is I think quite important. And there's one other piece, and this goes back to those levers of change idea. There's a huge emergence within philanthropy of these new forms of giving, LLCs, donor-advised funds that have no accountability that those of you in this room have currently, which frankly is quite a little amount of accountability legally. I call it opt-in accountability and opt-in transparency about how we fund and what we fund. But these have even less. And a lot of that is coming from the tech field. We have new wealth at massive scales that is going toward philanthropy and funding different issues, unrelated often to technology. But we as funders can often be in spaces with those funders in ways that movements can't. And for us not to only think about how we influence where the grant dollars are going, but to use that access as a way to have conversations about technology. When you see a new multi-million or even billion-dollar fund for education coming from the Zuckerbergs, that's one piece of the pie, but engaging them in a philanthropic conversation is also a chance to understand the tech space better, and try to bridge those gaps. And there are groups doing excellent work already on this. I mean, we have Access Now, Digital Democracy. I can think of some of the organizations I've worked with where they'll only communicate on Signal. You know, there are people who are showing us how to work just simply by doing it. Engaging with them, but using the access that we have and that our trustees have and that our partners have to be part of a conversation where perhaps some of those organizations who are doing the work can't access on their own, I think is really important when we think of the power that we have to shape what's happening within the digital space.
Great, thank you. And you've all outlined credible solutions, but as well as approaches that we should be thinking about in addressing rights within the digital space. Duncan, if I just may come to you around some of the challenges that are here. So, what challenges have you found in your work in looking to integrate and uphold human rights within the digital sphere with your grant making?
So I think first and foremost, it's recognizing that this is an issue that cuts across the entire human rights spectrum, right? So the field emerged with the title Digital Rights, which is a little bit opaque and perhaps put off some of those that wanted clarity in concepts and understanding of what the human rights issues were here. But in reality, it's about addressing human rights in the digital sphere. So it's a women's rights issue. It's an LGBTI rights issue. It's as well as an issue on civic space. So the surveillance capitalism aspect of this is a really important part, but it is only one part. So recognizing the broader frame, recognizing that we needed to develop expertise in a new field that perhaps some of our trustees had, that staff didn't have across the board. Engaging with other funders who are perhaps more specialist in that area. So Luminate, for example, has a major program on these issues. And then recognizing that most of our grantees also didn't have the skills and capacity in this area, and it wasn't enough simply to support a few groups that specialized here, but look at ways that we could support groups that themselves were then building capacity of others. So the Engine Room is an example of an organization that specializes in supporting other civil society organizations to develop capacity in this area. The Digital Freedom Fund supports others to litigate in this area. A sort of newer group called Foxglove in the UK also. So finding the new groups, but also recognizing that this is relevant to all of our grantees and all of our work.
Great, thank you for sharing that. And I'll just add, even also what you also see happening regionally and locally. So for example, groups like the Paradigm Initiative in West Africa that's looking at some of the structural elements from internet shutdowns as well as surveillance and how to address that within their context. So what's happened in the global level, you also see that taking place incredibly well at the regional and national local level. I think part of our role is also to make sure that we connect these groups across the different ecosystems, but also make sure, to your point, how we connect the different rights struggles within the digital sphere. So look what your question sparked, Doug. So let's open it up again to the audience if we have any other questions.
Hi, I'm Masha, I'm your colleague, Kizito from Open Society. It's a mix with comment, but I can't not make it. I think we sometimes speak of Ukraine like if it was over. It's not over, right? Just yesterday, like the massacre, right? What we saw from Bucha. And this is not a conflict, unlike some that are on the same territories that are like long term, even if this ruler will go, another one will come. If Putin is stopped, it will be over. And I think in our conversations and in global conversations, we are often missing this point, right? I sometimes feel that because we can't accept that US government is on the right side of history in this specific conflict, not conflict, aggression, right? There's no conflict. They move out, nobody is going to attack Russia. It's discomforting for us, right? Because that's why we are moving away from word human rights, word democracy, right? Because it's like the shame of funders. But in this moment, that's what Ukrainians want, right? Talk to any of them. It's like the word human rights, the word democracy, I'm sorry to say it, right? That's what they are fighting for. And we are afraid to support them. And we are like going around because we are trying to please everybody. We can't. We have to take a side. Accountability. Ukrainians will want accountability. These will be the women who will talk about the rape publicly to everybody. This is our chance. But we, as funders, have to live with this discomfort, right? That it doesn't, like our ideologies have changed from the times that we heard yesterday. Like, let's question that as well. This is a part of the world and the moment where we need to also recognize it. Why will we have food insecurity? Because Putin is not stopped. And if we don't keep repeating it, it sounds like, I listen to these talks, I'm like, what do you want? You want Ukraine to surrender? Like, what do you want? Like, of course, sanctions are bad for everybody. Tell me how to stop him otherwise, right? And I think it's important for us, like, I didn't hear the word accountability, right? So I'll turn it into question. What do you think the role of accountability should be? But I really call on us to live with this discomfort. That because it's a multipolar world, there is no one line anymore. And like sometimes the old line works, right? I don't know if it's right. And the last what I'll say, if you haven't read the RIA News, there is translation I can send to you, the Kremlin's mouthpiece yesterday, because they dealt with words human rights and democracy, right? That's co-opted. Now they're co-opting colonialism. Their whole piece is that Ukraine colonized the little Russians, and this is a project of decolonialization of Ukraine. So it doesn't matter, we'll move to the next world, Putin's Russia will colonize that world. Like, I'm ethnic Russian myself, right? So I just, sorry, had to say it.
Thank you for your comment. Any other questions from the audience?
Yeah, this is on another point, but I wanted to go back to what Regan said and the organizations you described that are working on food security or even food sovereignty, which I think is a great term. I guess I'm just curious to know, do those groups sort of self-identify as human rights organizations? Are they seen by others as human rights organizations in their communities and or at the kind of international level?
So there's no one answer to that question, but I'll start with a story because when we started the Fund for Global Human Rights, a lot of people were saying to us, well, what are you going to fund? And a lot of people wanted to find out if we would fund them, and we were struggling to come up with a definition. And I got asked this question a lot about, well, why are you funding these organizations that don't even have human rights in their name or whatever? And so I started asking activists when I met them, what's the value of human rights to the work that you do? And I will never forget a conversation I had at one point with the women who started the CUT, which is a women's labor rights organization in Puebla in Mexico. And I said to them, so what's the value of human rights in the work that you're doing? And they just looked at me like, what kind of question are you asking me? And I said, well, why do you think of yourselves as a human rights organization? What does that add to the advocacy you're doing on behalf of the women working in the maquiladoras? And they said, human rights is everything. It's the center of what we're doing because it's almost taken for granted. And going back to the conversation yesterday about these ideas of dignity and self-articulation and being able to stand up for your own rights and win against entities and individuals with far more power than you have, that was core to their identity. They didn't even need to talk about it. They just understood it. And I have found that that has been true in many organizations. They come to the work with whatever language they use, they're operating with a similar framework, which is, I mean, to pick up on Larry's point from yesterday, we have been excluded, we have been denied access to power, we are suffering as a consequence, and we want to use this framework to change that dynamic. And I will say, I'm sort of going into one of the other areas that we wanted to talk about with regard to how organizations responded to the COVID crisis. But one of the things that was so interesting that we saw was that a number of organizations had to pivot to become first responders to their communities. They had to make sure that they got access to food when supplies were completely cut off. They had to provide access to reliable medical information, none of which, you know, those of us who have experienced some part of the history of the human rights movement in London and New York and other places necessarily would think of as human rights work in a classical sense. But what they're also doing is using that interface with the communities to document the different ways in which they're excluded and using that as a basis for challenging the status quo and the government. So they have a documentation of how communities are marginalized and then use that to advance human rights arguments for why it should change. So there is, I mean, I know Kimberly Crenshaw is the one who came up with the word intersectionality, and it was born in a law school classroom in the United States. But these groups live it every day. They don't need to define intersectionality because it is how their lives and their advocacy unfolds.
Fantastic points. Thank you for sharing that. And so that's shifting to the pandemic, as you've been describing. Kelly, if you'd like to expand on what Reagan has helpfully shared.
Yes, I think one of the pieces that you were describing about the aftermath of intersectional organizing is also something to take into account before. It wasn't that these groups came out of nowhere. They already were doing human rights work. So when they were responding in an emergency, they did it with that, through that lens. And so, I mean, one of the things that we saw, I was working with AWID at the time, the Association for Women's Rights and Development, and in the immediate follow-up from the pandemic and the closures that were happening, and the crackdown on civil society that occurred, both digitally and as an excuse, using COVID as an excuse to make it very difficult to gather, we saw mutual aid societies, and it wasn't just the services, it was groups of sex workers coordinating with groups of farmers to ensure that people had food and then working to deliver it to hotels, which offered spaces to get people off the streets. I mean, that, if that's not intersectionality, I don't know what is. The other thing that I think came out with COVID that was so hopeful, and I am uncertain if it will remain, is that we saw, again, the way that different forms of oppression were completely interrelated. You could not watch what happened, let's say in the US or globally, and pretend that you don't need a racial justice lens, for instance, that you don't need to think about the impact on LGBTQ+ communities, that you don't need a women's rights and gender justice approach. It was impossible. I find that very hopeful. Whether that will lead to anything long-term very much remains to be seen. We are still in a pandemic. This is not an endemic. Just a reminder, we're not wearing masks today, but don't let that fool you. The other thing is that I saw the affirmation of community-led activism, and that goes to the mutual aid societies, but much broader than that. And the way that funders showed up. I mean, how many decades have we been trying to get people in our own field and beyond to give core flexible funding? If I write another report with that as a recommendation, I'm going to fall asleep while I'm typing. We have been advocating for that for so long, and suddenly in the pandemic, what seemingly was impossible was suddenly happening. Fewer restrictions, trust-based funding, core support. I think that is so hopeful. But at the same time, I think there remain the questions of whether this will lead to anything. And I think the fact that vaccine inequality is still so prevalent, the fact that we are still seeing very poor coordination on a global scale. I mean, if you compare the coordination that happened during the smallpox epidemic to what's happening now, we are so far behind in coordinating. And I think this leads to the discussion yesterday. There has been such a fundamental decline in the state of global governance. Our institutions that from the early 1900s, but certainly after World War II, were so fundamental to the framework of human rights, have been degraded. I don't know if it's because we've gotten complacent in some ways. I certainly know that it has been intentional on the part of authoritarian regimes. But I think that COVID is flagging again a mistrust that those of us who believe in social justice approaches have in those institutions. And I will talk more about authoritarianism and how we get serious about intervening there. But I think when we are looking at the after effects and the current effects of this pandemic, understanding the degradation of the global governance system is something that we as a field also need to think, do we need to invest there? Have we divested from that system? And what do we need to do going forward?
Great, thank you. And thank you for sharing those points and hope, where we see the human rights movement changing in terms of the infrastructure for the unrestricted funding, as well as the trust-based grants that have been grant-making that we have done throughout the pandemic, and how that shift has happened, but also the challenges, as you've raised. And in terms of the platforms for global governance, but also around intersectionality and issues that still need to be addressed. So on that point on intersectionality, Mona, during the pandemic, gender equality and women's rights have been negatively impacted. What should we take into account for gender responsive recovery?
Really important question. I think Kalia already highlighted some of what we saw happened at the grassroots. Part of trust-based philanthropy, which has sort of been unleashed and I hope stays around forever, is that it's important to build systems change from the ground up, right? Philanthropy has traditionally been very top-down. And you can't make change, especially in the middle of a crisis. Well, first you can't see each other, you can't see what's going on, but you have to have implicit trust in the proximity of people who are on the ground experiencing the difficulties and then finding often the best solutions to combat those difficulties. So I think how we fund has to change. It has changed, but it has to stay that way, in that we build up the resources and the leadership of people on the ground to be able to combat these issues. The second point I'd say is the connections, because people all over the world have come up with very innovative solutions to problems which many of us thought were unsolvable, and yet they have been. I mean, it was interesting to see which communities were deemed essential, right? So we know that there were a lot of places of for sexual violence, for example, shelters were not deemed essential. So even though their numbers of people who were seeking their services were going through the roof, they had no basic support, they had no PPE. This is where philanthropy steps in, right? So I know from our group, for example, we resourced them. We had access to organizations that could bring in PPE from China or wherever it was being manufactured and get them out to these communities. We could reach out to corporate donors who wanted to, quote unquote, do something, but didn't know quite what to do. Well, we could help them figure out what to do. So there's that connection piece, but there's also, you know, somewhere, and this is happening now, we're sort of seeing it, is people keep asking me, what's the new normal? Well, there isn't one new normal. There are lots of lessons that need to be now organized and need to be put into a place where we can actually deep dive into it and look at the ecosystem work. You know, it's a word, but it's a real thing as well. So what different aspects, civil society, governments, I would hold corporates also very much accountable, because none of us have been spared from seeing our dogs in the Zoom rooms and babies crying and all of that. So let's like finally accept that we are made up of many selves, and it's not just we show up at work as people who work and then we show up at home as, you know, people at home. We have multiple identities. So all of these things are really important. I think prioritizing the care economy, we've seen how hard it's been to balance and do this juggling act from working from home and having children doing school at home and not having access to digital resources and so forth. So I think the jury is still out. We don't have a comprehensive sort of collective of lessons learned. There are some very interesting convenings that are happening now, that are beginning to happen now, that are trying to gather those, and I think we should just be mindful of circulating some of those resources widely so that we can learn from and keep going the lessons that we've unleashed.
Fantastic, great point shared, Mona. So I have a question that's come from the online space from our colleague Greg. I think many of you know him. So what are, and this is open for any of you on the panel, what are the risks of philanthropy exacerbating the risks of top-down, not rights-based approaches to land and resources amid this ongoing and about to get much worse hunger crisis? And what should philanthropy be doing and funding? So yes to the local groups, Reagan, that you mentioned, and anything else to support rights-based food sovereignty rather than just food security that often doesn't give people power over their own food and resources, including at the structural and international level. Who would like to take this one? Mona?
I'll start with power, right? That's a really important word. And I will say that we've seen around the world that women don't have a lot of power. So if you look at food security, I was funding a group in India that was looking at agriculture and lowering the dependence on rain. And I remember they reached out to me to ask about the strength of their programs, and I said, who are you training? Because they were looking at financing. They were teaching these groups how to finance their agricultural productivity through irrigation systems and solar panels and so forth. And they were training all the men in the village, which is not a surprise. And I said, why aren't you training the women? And that just wasn't in the equation. They called me, I said, call me back in 6 months. And sure enough, they did, because the rains failed. Guess where all the men went? They went into the towns looking for jobs, and guess who was harvesting the crops? It was the women who hadn't had the training. The other piece we see with food security is women don't have rights to land. And that is something fundamental that needs to change. So there are these little things. I'll tell you a nice success story in Zambia. Again, food insecurity was a big issue in the Lower Zambezi, which is a very poor part of the world. And we formed women into these cooperatives, because women like to be collaborative, they like to be in community. And we started teaching them about solar energy. And they got so excited about it. I mean, they were sitting around in groups and building these solar panels, and they saw the impact it had, because from just having small farm holdings that they could now irrigate because they had the power from solar, they realized that they had crops that they could sell. And we know what happens when you put money in women's hands, right? The whole ecosystem changed. And the same thing in India. Those of you who don't know Barefoot College, please visit their website, because that is a model that is brilliant and started in the 70s and still going strong to today.
Thanks so much, Mona, and the whole important point you're raising around power and building that and then what it leads to. So moving on to one other question related to the pandemic, we touched on a little bit, which is around emergency measures. So emergency measures have been normalized, leading to restrictions on fundamental freedoms. Duncan, this is for you. What rights were affected, and what should be prioritized for us to address with the fallout that we're seeing from how governments have shifted in this authoritarian way? And that will lead us to our next topic, but curious, from the pandemic, what should we be thinking about as philanthropy on this issue?
I mean, it's a huge question in a way, because of course all rights were implicated in the pandemic. Those who were denied the realization of their rights to just conditions at work, those who were minoritized faced increased risks during the pandemic. Those that couldn't get access to adequate health care or vaccines, of course, that threatened the right to life. In relation to the emergency measures, I'll just take two examples. So Hungary, of course, famously introduced a number of omnibus bills that were rushed through Parliament with inadequate scrutiny and really fast-tracked what the government was aiming to do anyway, which was restricting dissent restricting civic space even further. Kenya, similarly, incredibly oppressive enforcement of curfews with abusive policing and police killings. And so these were not apparitions. It's not something that happened because of the pandemic. The pandemic was the opportunity to deepen the direction that the governments were inclined to go in any case. And you saw, a disability rights activist, for example, detained for criticizing the removal of patients for hospitals to clear beds in Hungary. That was a case taken up by the Hungarian Helsinki Committee. You saw people fined excessive amounts for peeping their horns in protest at the scapegoating of certain population groups around the pandemic in Kenya. So the answer to your question in one way is really does lead us into the authoritarian question. I mean, I feel like I should pause here and move on to that section of the conversation because it's not unique to the pandemic. The pandemic created an extra focus and opportunity for the measures that governments were inclined to take in any case.
Great. Thank you, Duncan. To that point, the pandemic was used as a pretext by many of these governments to increasingly surveil their citizens, stifle dissent, as you raised, as well as use securitization to trample rights. So as we shift to this topic on authoritarianism, I wanted to flag that, for the first time since 2001, a majority of the world's population lives under non-democratic, rights-violating governments. We've also seen a weakening of multilateralism with the rise of nationalism and populism, a limiting global action that has allowed many of these bad actors to act with impunity and evade accountability. So as we think about our solutions, as we think about what we prioritize, the environment in which we can be able to take forward this struggle is increasingly making it more difficult. So to that point, Kelia, what must be done to counter increasing authoritarianism and its impact on the human rights framework? You have the big question.
Yeah, I was gonna say I'm gonna focus on what we can do, and I would add to the statistics. In Mike Edwards' recent edition of his book on civil society, he says that only 3% of the world's population is living in a fully open society at the moment. I keep thinking, when I think about this, I think about Masha's point, which I will don't want to have lost, come back to in a second, but something that I think Martine said yesterday around getting used to working with authoritarian regimes. And if it wasn't you, it was someone else on your panel brilliantly raising that. I think we need to take the enemy more seriously. I really do. I think that we are in a different moment and we need to recognize that. I think that we need to understand that the anti-rights movement is a movement. Treat it that way. Treat the funding of it as a threat and counter it. I have been thinking also about how we frame our work, and I raised this a bit yesterday, but I've been at Human Rights Funders Network. We did audience research with a pilot study. We had about 400 respondents, about half funders, half civil society, asking about what values mattered to them. We worked with this group called Bridges, led by Monica Roa, who was a Colombian abortion rights activist who had to flee the country. She was a human rights defender under threat. What she had done and the way that she had worked to secure decriminalization and leading into legalization very recently, she wasn't trying to use the framework that resonated with those of us who are already converted. She did a lot of this audience research and took a marketing approach to understand what values were driving people, what narratives made sense. She, in that work, used a family-first framework. We believe in the family. And the family can look like this. And she started redefining that. And I think when we're talking about working within, taking the enemy seriously, that we need to do the same kind of reframing and not be afraid to lose some of the nuance on a global level while we keep it within these conversations and in our funding. So that's one piece. I also feel like we really need to prepare our own organizations and our movements in ways that we have not effectively done. And while Duncan was giving really great examples of what that preparation would look like, I also know that he's been part of our learning journey on crisis preparedness with OSF, with folks from Ford, Wellspring, many of us here today. And we're a bit like a deer in headlights when it comes to these crises. I mean, really, how many of you have gone through crisis preparedness training to practice for when the next crisis comes? How many of us have prepared enough that when the next crackdown happens in Uganda and civil society groups are deregistered in advance of an election, we know exactly what we will do? These crises keep happening, and they will keep happening, and we are not adequately prepared, and we are not adequately facing that this is a rolling wave. So there's an aspect of the preparation, taking it seriously, and then when I think about the role of human rights philanthropy in particular, it comes back to some of the very first conversations yesterday. It is funding where others can't. It is taking risks. It is doing whatever you need to do that you can't say in a room where we have people on Zoom because you don't know who's there, to get the money into the places where frontline defenders are taking those risks. So being willing to do that, coordinating together, and then supporting movements. And we talked, I think it was on the last panel yesterday, about recognizing that change is not just progress, that it includes holding the line. Measuring our impact as something that is always progressive is felt possible, I think, at a time, and that's not where we are right now. We need to recognize that simply holding the line is progress in many of these contexts, and that to do so requires low-grade, long-term support.
Thank you, and thank you for that rallying cry and what we need to do. You know, I think to your point around that we need to take it seriously, and we need to think about a reframing to the good point that was raised earlier around Russia's role and aggression, and how we need to match our action to be serious in what we need to confront. I'll also add to that you know, our rhetoric must also match our action. We speak a good game, but where are the actions to back that up? And to that point, Reagan, you know, authoritarians have captured many significant policy spaces on human rights, like with the Human Rights Council or with other multilateral bodies. What should philanthropy do to address this growing challenge in these platforms and spaces that enforce and advance human rights?
Thanks, Kizito. I think that, you know, reflecting on some of the conversation yesterday about how it feels like governments at least used to say the right things about human rights, and now they don't even bother to do that, I think underscores the idea that multilateral institutions depend, their effectiveness and their ability to operate depends on at least some degree of good faith participation by the governments who create them and engage them, which is not to say that looking back on that history, I think those governments were necessarily there planning to be held strictly accountable for their human rights performance. And in fact, in some ways, I think the retrenchment of governments and the hostility to some of these multilateral institutions is because they realized that they could actually become something that got in the way of their own desire to consolidate power. But I think that I have a two-part answer to your question. One, it will not surprise you, is that I think that the idea of supporting local civil society has to be at the forefront of thinking about how we get multilateral institutions back. And that is because they are, you know, the stronger civil society is, the more able they are to hold their governments accountable, the more able they are to create a narrative that goes against the idea of authoritarian capture of these institutions, and the more able they are to coordinate across borders. Because that's the other thing here. I mean, when we talk about taking these problems seriously and funding them seriously, it can't just be we'll fund globally or we'll fund locally. We have to do both, and we have to fund in a way that allows people to build global campaigns that involve all the actors who are affected by the consequences of authoritarianism. And I think that that's something that, again, donors have recognized the need for that. There's something called the Funders Initiative for Civil Society, which is actively laying the groundwork for building coordinated cross-border campaigns to challenge things that run through almost every part of the conversation we've had so far. So, for example, authoritarianism, but also a lot of what the intersection of a lot of these trends all of these trends also intersect with the security narrative, right? So since 9/11, this driving rationale of we should be able to do whatever we need to do in response to the threat of terrorism has created all kinds of problems and has become a smokescreen for a lot of the repressive measures that are really just about the consolidation of power. So I think looking at how you tackle those narratives in a way that is not just about one voice in the wilderness, but is about looking at the different actors in this space and how we can fund them to collaborate. Interestingly, and I think this is not necessarily the history of human rights activism going back 20 or 30 years, but we did a survey of almost 200 of our grantees during COVID to find out how their work had changed. And 90% of them talked about the importance of collaboration in their work. So there is a recognition that we are more effective when we are greater in number and when we bring our different skills and tools to bear to our shared problems. And that, I think, thinking about not just how you fund organizations that can demonstrate that they individually make a difference, but how do you fund collaboration and networks that create global power on the part of the people who are advancing these issues. I mean, if you take Masha's point about how profound the challenges are to the ideas of decency and rights that we are talking about here, we need to have a just as profound a response.
Excellent, thank you for that. And to your point on collaboration, the global power in terms of the different groups and communities coming together to address these challenges, we often also see that happening amongst movements. So I just want us to touch a little bit on movements, and that's a question that is also flagged in the online space, because there's a tension between between movements and trust-based philanthropy. You know, as you know, donors are now moving towards the sharper metrics, evidence-based investments, but then we need to also support the ecosystem of activism, and movements really are at the front line of that. They're often the first port of call in defending and advancing rights, but this can also be fraught with movement capture, much like how we'd be discussing about the political capture within these human rights-based institutions and platforms. Mona, maybe if I can come to you on this. You know, what should philanthropies know in how we think about movements in addressing authoritarianism, but also to the larger point in terms of their work and how we interact with them as funders?
So I think movements have been critical in creating social change. I mean, they would not have happened if movements didn't happen. And I'm going to pick up on something Reagan said, is that there is power in collaboration and there is power in bringing people together. Because I think what movements have the power to do is to change the minds of people who oppose them in many ways and bring them along, which then the consolidated effort is much more successful in overthrowing authoritarianism to the extent that you can. But I want to go back to something that was said in the audience about not being able to stop Putin in this moment, because what scares me is that we are looking at other authoritarian regimes across the world. I mean, I'm thinking Turkey, India, Philippines, you know, and these leaders are watching to see what the world response is going to be. And I think if the movements don't collaborate across the world to say this is not acceptable, and therefore we need a different funding model, and I picked up on a word that Reagan used, which is network. You know, I think we need to start thinking about how do we fund networks and how do we use technology to help us in connecting these networks so that we provide a framework around the world to be able to tackle some of these issues. I mean, you've seen the power of movements in gender rights in this country, for example, over the last century, you know, where women have fought unsuccessfully for equal rights in our Constitution. It's some work that Jessica and I do together, and we still don't have it in the US Constitution, which is a very basis of how legal systems, you know, can challenge things like gender-based violence and sexual assault and so forth. So I don't think our work is cut out for us, but I think there have been some interesting conversations in this room that can maybe make us rethink how we support network movement building across the world.
Great, thank you, Mona. And picking up on what you shared around this environment of impunity leading to limited accountability, especially against authoritarians and their actions. So Duncan, with the weakening of judicial mechanisms that we've seen globally, as well as a lack of international accountability, what should philanthropy do to address this? What can we learn from what the Trust has been able to do in terms of its approach to strengthen the human rights field?
So, firstly, I think on the question of accountability, and all of these questions, we need to exercise some humility. I'm guided by our chair, who says fundamentally our job is to find the best groups, give them money, and let them do what they think is needed to address these problems. And to Masha's question, yes, of course, we're supporting groups in Ukraine and outside of Ukraine who are collaborating on documenting alleged war crimes and pursuing accountability. And within broader authoritarian contexts, supporting groups that are exercising creative approaches to pursuing accountability. So the Hungarian Civil Liberties Union, the Hungarian Helsinki Committee, using the European Union's Article 7 enforcement mechanisms to exert pressure on Hungary from outside of the country in ways that have been impactful. And that's a tried and tested human rights approach of creatively exploring different accountability mechanisms. The Treatment Action Campaign in South Africa didn't only go through the traditional court system, it also went to the Competition Commission with some very notable success on relaxing patent regimes. So, and the other point to make, of course, is that the distaste for accountability is not uniquely held by so-called authoritarian regimes. I live in London at the moment, and the government just down the road from where I live has demonstrated, consistently a distaste for being held accountable, even based on the deeply English notion of parliamentary supremacy and seeking to avoid the accountability of Parliament, let alone the courts in recent years. So we need to address this accountability gap or impunity culture where it exists in authoritarian regimes and on others that are models in some ways, or that give cover for the worst approaches. The second part of your question on what we can do and the Trust's approach to strengthening the human rights field, we're helped by a decade or more of introspection within the human rights field on what we got right, what we got wrong, how we ended up in this place, how we need to recognize the strength of the so-called human rights ecosystem, to use Cesar Rodriguez Garavito's concept, recent reviews such as the excellent book by Gronya de Burka that I'm reading at the moment, and very much enjoying, that help us to recognize the importance of supporting a diverse range of actors who may or may not themselves identify as parts of the human rights movement, investigative journalists, artists, movements as well, and to rethink, refresh, and diversify the human rights field, and not to continue doing only the thing that we had been doing for the most part for the longest period, with some success in many areas. Let's not forget that LGBTI rights is just one example of huge leaps forward in the last few decades, but clearly with some gaps. So with a lot of humility, I would say that we have set a vision for doing that in our own flagship human rights program, and have shifted in large part our funding. The Trust's past grantees in the human rights field program, 70% of them were based in the United States and the United Kingdom. That figure at the moment is about a third. Of the new grantees that we brought in last year, 85% of them were based in our focus regions. So the notion of the anchor organizations that we heard yesterday being the INGOs is not the one that we are putting into practice in our work right now. The anchors are the national level organizations, the groups that I have mentioned and many others. But that in itself is not enough. We need to support the field where it is, And in many of our regions in Central Asia, for example, those anchor organizations may not be the most diverse and they may not be the most innovative, but looking to where the field could be enhanced, refreshed, and complemented without, making that a choice. It's an and, it's not an either. But also recognizing the important role that international NGOs play, I would say, as supporters. So either technical assistance, groups like EHRAC that supports national level organizations to litigate successfully at the European Court of Human Rights, networks like ECNL that support groups in different countries that are facing variations on the same tactics in repressive regimes to learn from one another. So networks that share strategies among their members. So anchors, innovators, and supporters. And innovators, of course, includes some of the creative, shiny groups like Forensic Architecture that we all know of. But it also includes those groups that are seeking to engage with different audiences. A group in Morocco, for example, that's engaging with football fans to try to increase the support base for human rights. That's the intention. In reality, we can't be searching for unicorns the whole time. We need to fundamentally support the field where it is, as well as looking at where it might be in the future.
Robust vision. Thank you for that, Duncan. And to your point, not searching for the unicorns, not searching for the specific niche, but to add. Where can we add in our support and what we do?
Just very briefly, I completely agree with what you were saying, and I think there's the corollary for ourselves as funders to also understand how we fit in. Who is funding the not all rushing to fund in one space, but who is filling that at the grassroots level, who is working at a national level, who is working on global governance, and how can we, in a field that I think has a lot more rhetoric than reality when it comes to sharing data and sharing strategies ahead of time rather than after the fact, how can we be much more coordinated so we're mapping our own ecosystem to ensure that collectively, not individually as institutions, but collectively as a field, we're funding across the full ecosystem of human rights.
Great. Thank you, Kalia. We have a question in the audience. Sandy.
Used to be with OSF and continue working on international justice. Really fascinating conversation. I'd like to bring you, Kizito, in substantively as well as Martine to hear a bit about the Ford and OSF thinking. And I'm remembering a conversation, Martine, that you led at the Justice Initiative 2 or 3 years ago. We talked about how central support for rule of law and the legal infrastructure had been in the 90s, and Ford's leadership and your leadership in developing that. You described, you compared rule of law to the trains, that we will always need the trains, but that there's new technology out there and there's new challenges out there, and there's, we are at a time that requires transformative change. OSF, Mark Malloch Brown is talking about leading a transformation. Something needs to be done fundamentally different. The challenges that we're facing are fundamentally different than they were when OSF was established. A key part is challenging authoritarians. And I want to bring back our conversation from yesterday as we were looking at the development of human rights, which has been so interesting to see how rapidly over 60 years, the field has changed from a beginning point of amnesty and a focus on civil and political rights to an expansion to understand the importance of universality, as Rita mentioned. Aryeh mentioned bringing in humanitarian law, but that was just to address war crimes. That wasn't to address the crime of aggression. Now we are looking at embracing the crime of aggression and moving into that field. And then Mark was talking about politics and political philanthropy and the need to sharpen our elbows. And I'd love to hear more about the thinking about the how close do we get into the field of politics? We want to break down silos, but where are the red lines? And George Soros will say that one of his biggest mistakes was crossing that line regarding Georgia. We now know that an objective is to get to remove Putin, but not just to remove and wait for the successors of the palace coup, but something transformative. So concluding, when we look at trying to bridge the silos, we're talking about addressing corruption. We're talking about sometimes humanitarian assistance is part of the human rights toolkit. Sometimes the economic forums are part. And Martine, Saleh Booker was talking about the importance of moving out to those economic forums. So where are the opportunities? Where are the red lines that we shouldn't cross? And what do we mean by political philanthropy?
Big question. Martine, would you like to? Okay.
I definitely not prepared and don't have an answer prepared for that, but a couple of comments. And your comment about the trains is a metaphor that some of you may have heard me use before, and it's something related to what we were discussing yesterday, right? It's the idea that, when trains were invented at the beginning of the 19th century, they made into history books, and everyone was talking about trains. And today, no one is talking about trains, but there are many more people benefiting from trains today than at the beginning of the 19th century. What I'm saying is trains are today more important than back then, but still, they are not making history. I think to some extent, we need to think about the human rights movement that way, that the human rights movement made history during the last 25 years of the 20th century, but that doesn't mean that history is going to be made by the human rights movement forever, right? And that maybe the human rights movement needs to learn how to accompany and not try to be the central figure in social change. And that this is a moment that maybe technology is leading social change, or China may be leading social change in a positive way or whatever, but really understanding that change may be coming from different places, not necessarily from where they were coming 25 years ago. In that sense, I do think that continue to work on human rights is critical, right? It's absolutely critical. And we, at the Ford Foundation at least, have been trying to do that while bringing that to all our programs and doing more work around human rights than before, but in a different way. So in that sense, this doesn't mean about doing less human rights related work, but it's also about understanding what is driving change these days. And maybe what is driving change these days is not necessarily the same. And your question about technology is a very important question, and there are many other issues related to that. So in that sense, to your question about political philanthropy and et cetera, I still think that it's always being in the business of social change, and it's understanding that. And I don't necessarily think that political philanthropy is the only way that we are going to be able to, achieve that kind of progress that we are looking for. I think that what we are thinking here is to really understanding some of the new complexities that we are working on. So, I think that your comment about global governance, that's exactly right. I think that, like, at least the Ford Foundation for many years felt like we were done with that. We did our share in the 60s, and we don't need to pay attention. Like in the 90s, we kind of, in the late 90s, early 2000, we basically closed most of our global governance work, and now we are going back to it, right? It's like we are saying, like, okay, so I think that kind of nimbleness or flexibility is what we need in a moment like this. I actually don't want to embrace any kind of certainty these days. I think this is a moment where we need to be mostly testing new things to see if we find a way to really start, if we identify what are the new paths that are going to make that difference. So anyway, it's a very long and very abstract answer. We can get into more details, but But I think that that's what we are trying to do. It's like understanding global governance, focusing on global economic governance, thinking about human rights in a more integrated way, and so forth.
Great, thanks, Martin. And just briefly to what you asked, Sandy, so with political philanthropy, we're all in the change-making business and change-supporting business. So to your point, by us thinking about ourselves and moving forward as a political philanthropy, we're trying to identify how can we best be situated in order to drive that change and support that change. So part of that is looking at the different levers where in terms of the different arenas where that is, in terms of governance, in terms of thinking about the private sector, for example, where are the different sources of power that will leverage change on a certain issue? The organizing aspect of that is where we're looking to take forward some of these internal changes in how we support this work. So for example, Mark touched a little bit yesterday, I think, on campaigns. Part of that work is how we're thinking about accelerating impact on some of the issues that we're working on. It's not about changing from where we've been in terms of the grant making, the careful grant making that we've done for decades. That will always still continue. But what we're trying to do is see how we can best tool, support the organizations that we have been advancing, and do so in a way where we also use our space, our leverage, and our access and opportunities to help them in their journeys for the larger goal that we're all working on towards together. So if it's a certain issue, for example, like vaccine access, we have access in space that many of our grantee partners don't. How do we accompany them in this journey for the political change that needs to happen? And so part of that is the organizing. You know, when you think about our role as philanthropy, it's beyond just supporting grantees. It's taking agency, aligned, of course, with what our grantee partners do, but doing so in a way where we're supporting together as a whole the ecosystem and the collaboration that we've been speaking about today. So we have to think of ourselves as actors, not only as supporters, but actors in a careful way where we're working with the partners like we have always done in the past, but recognizing our role and our responsibility in this larger ecosystem of change. And so that's a long way to say, you know, why we're, about our work being a political philanthropy, but it's in the same direction that we've always been. But, you know, to the point that you made about those sharp elbows, we have to get stronger and more robust in our response. And this is a way that's driving us forward to that. Questions? If you had, I think you had a question first.
Brad Smith. I was at Ford Foundation actually when in the first era of global governance work, so good you're getting back to it. And more recently at Candid, which has worked quite closely with the Human Rights Funders Network to actually map the human rights funding universe, and dealing with the question you asked of the panel about, or somebody asked about, do groups identify themselves as human rights groups that are doing human rights work? And the answer is most of them do not, but that doesn't mean they're not doing human rights work. So the question I had was actually in relation to something that Mark Malik Brown said last night about, you know, being a global power and having to exercise both the politics of influence, not just the politics of values. Now, when I look at all of you on the panel and the names of your organizations and what you do, in your own way, you're all global powers. And I was wondering, as leaders of your organizations, in a world in which there's increasing pressure from both outside organizations and inside organizations to be consistent with your values and have the right position on issues, how you really deal with a world of increasing authoritarianism, increasing nuance, increasing shades of gray, where you have to work in gray spaces and do things that might not, or your staff might not see, or your supporters might not see as being consistent with your values in order to obtain the results you're looking for.
Great, thanks. Let's take a couple of questions. So I think we had 2 more, and then a panel can answer how you choose.
Thanks. Karen Landgren from Security Council Report. This is an observation, and I can turn it into a question if you insist, but perhaps it's more please comment. I wanted to respond to some of the things that have been said about global governance, multilateral institutions, and pushing back on aggression. I think we're hearing a lot these days comments to the effect of, oh, the Security Council is useless, and it's just kind of conclusively proved how useless it is in the case of Ukraine. For various reasons, I don't think this is what has been shown, that the Council has never been good at pushing back on conflict generated by permanent members. But it's true that for some years, the Security Council has not been a good place for norm strengthening or preventing conflict. However, there are some brighter developments in terms of the role of small states, civil society briefers, pressure to work on climate, and since COVID, vaccine equity and food security. I mean, these things are coming out strongly. So what I want to suggest is that instead of thinking of the Security Council as a tired 77-year-old institution that is no longer fit for purpose, we also see it as a front line for defending the values of the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration. Reframe how we think about it, because it can still do those things, but it will need a lot of work and a lot of pressure. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Vinnie McGee, I just wanted to raise a different possibility in terms of political influence and the use of funding. Non-deductible giving by our donors, our board members, our friends, our families. The importance of individuals responding quickly, simply writing a check from their checkbook. I think of one example years ago when Mairead Corrigan and Betty William from Ireland were in Argentina, and they called and said, "We need a ticket." I said, "What do you mean you need a ticket?" "Well, we have somebody who needs exposure in Europe, but we need a ticket today and tomorrow." So a ticket was provided, a few $100s at the time. And several months later, Esquivel got the Nobel Prize because they needed exposure. So I think we need to challenge. We all know about in the United States using non-deductible money, but there are other opportunities that mean quick possibility, quick action, and I think also of Occupy Wall Street. Occupy Wall Street hasn't been mentioned here, but it made a huge difference in all the things we're talking about. And most of that was funded by small donors. It wasn't deductible. It generated a huge amount of activity.
Great, thank you for that comment. And to that point on Occupy Wall Street, we didn't speak about the role of social protest as well in countering authoritarianism that we saw across 2020 and continuing now. That's another subject that we can be able to get into, but we're almost at time. I think we just have one more question from the online space that I'll ask the panel. What I'll ask is, for the question around the gray areas and the other question I'll ask, just to reflect on that briefly, and then a closing remark for the group. And so the question is, just could the panelists comment on whether you see a need to return to funding fundamental work on the theoretical framework of human rights in light of the Trump administration's Commission on Inalienable Rights and efforts of some in the US to return to the definition and enforcement of rights to the states. So that in gray area. Anyone would like to take that?
I can start. I think the answer to that question is to some extent, but on a smaller scale. I feel like we should recognize that many movements that we might categorize as human rights movements don't identify as such. I think there's absolutely a need for an investment in that framework, but I do not want us to rush toward that at the expense of continuing, as Darren was talking about last night, to support movements against anti-blackness, movements, feminist movements that might not identify within that framework. So I think it's a both and. And I love your question, Bradford. I saw my best friend's mom last night, and I said, Zoe and I used to dream up having a revolution of gray. It was one of those kind of college fancies, and I thought, we need to bring it back. And I think it doesn't start with standing in the gray. It starts with recognizing who we really are. And at HRFN, we've been on this journey, and this allowing ourselves to start from a place of justice. We want our staff to be embedded in movements. We want to be global south based. We are trying to reflect in who we are, in our leadership, and in our priorities, a pretty radical shift for funding, not at all radical if you talk to most of our movements. But staying within our lane. So even while we're trying to be moving forward thinking in that way, we're still very much focused on organizing funders. We had huge conversations and listened to people. Should we be open to civil society? And we're not. We don't feel like that's the place that we need to be. But we do feel like as a network, we can push the needle a little bit. We can partner with people who can say much more radical things than we can. And we can also partner with people who can say the more conservative things. And what I've found with our staff over this 1.5-year journey is that even though many of us come from movements and have fairly left politics, we're okay living with that in that space of gray. We recognize that you need to present a narrative that fits with the audience, and for us to be willing to do that without compromising our values, I think I have found in this process that it has felt quite possible, and maybe more so than I had anticipated.
I'll pick up on that, Clea. I think gray is critically important because right now what we're seeing is black and white. And when there isn't that conversation in the gray, it really doesn't push either the narrative forward or the action forward to change things. To talk about the frameworks are very important because they give people a way to think about an issue. But go back to the conversation last night, frameworks are executed differently among different groups. So I think what we heard last night, which is critically important, is it's important to bring people up to a level where the universality can actually be achieved. Because as we've seen, it's not universal, and rights are not universal. So how do we bring people to a level where we can actually begin having those conversations about everyone and everything and everywhere, because we're not at that place right now. And in our work, certainly we see gender as a big construct. Someone was talking about taking politics down to the state levels. I mean, yes, we've made huge strides in the LGBTQ rights area, but look at what's happening with trans rights today. Look at the states across the United States putting in legislation that bans trans children from participating in sports, or actually criminalizes parents of trans children for just being supportive of their choices. So we have to be very nimble, but we also have to keep our eye on the ball so that as sort of the new issues come up, we don't forget about the fundamental issues that are still being attacked every day.
Thank you, Mona. We're at time, so what I will do is say, and thank you, Kali, as well, too. What I'll do is, for all the panelists, maybe we can just have a closing remark, just a few sentences, because we've covered a range of issues today, from the Ukraine, to the pandemic, to technological repression, and to authoritarianism. What are some takeaways and take-homes that we would like to provide the audience in a few sentences from our discussion today? Start with Duncan, then Reagan, then Mona, and then we'll end with you, Kalia.
So I just make one point that follows on, I think, from what Mona just said. We've talked a lot about responding to the emerging issues, being responsive, and let's not do that at the expense of recognizing that long-term investments in supporting the field are really where we've seen the most impact over the history of the human rights field. That it is there is a risk in pivoting and diverting to address the emerging issue, the crisis. And I think that links into a point that hasn't been made, but I want to make about avoiding the tyranny of impact assessment, and recognizing the point that was made yesterday, I thought really powerfully by Akwazi, about the importance of supporting and sustaining those that are maintaining human rights values, even in contexts where the possibility of any systemic impact in the medium term is extremely low, and recognizing that impact in those contexts might be found at the individual level of getting detained, getting people who are detained for speaking out of jail or whatever it is. So yeah, recognizing the importance of investments for the longer term.
I'll second that, and then I'd like to bring us back to a word that has been woven into the conversation since yesterday, and that is the nature of power. And I think as donors, I think one of the gifts of the social movements that we have been part of and unsettled by over the course of the past couple of years is that they've really challenged us to be honest about what power looks like and what power is in our institutions, as well as how our institutions engage in the world. And I think that's a really important conversation to keep having if we want to take advantage of this moment of flux in the conversation about human rights philanthropy and position human rights philanthropy to be driving forward the kinds of change that have surfaced in this conversation, as opposed to just reacting to the crises that are constantly unfolding. And so I think that requires a lot of navigation of gray space, because there are things we can and cannot do based on where we sit. But seeing what our power is, being honest about how we exercise it within our institutions and in the world, and then thinking about what the implications are for the kind of risks we're willing to take to pursue the world that we, I think, are all interested in seeing. So that would be where I'd land after this really great conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, I will thread that thought by saying, we bring it down to an individual level because we participate as individuals in a collective organization. And I think the importance of recognizing the agency that we hold in ourselves, not just as leaders of movements or leaders of funders and all of that, but to also step into a place where we can be a little radical, right? Where we can listen and not just hear what we want to hear, but actually listen. So that's the gray space conversation that needs to happen a lot more. And I think we can also be much more radically generous, because if each of us looks at what we really need, kind of let's define what's enough for the individual, for families, for societies, and then decide, what we can do without, and we can actually, celebrate people around us. Just start in your own neighborhood. You don't have to go into the whole world. And make some differences, and then that echoes out into the universe.
My thoughts combine both of those in a way, which is also recognizing our humanity. We keep talking as if we're removed from the things we're funding, and we're not. I'm exhausted from working at home and trying to balance all of these things in some household full of children. I mean, we are all struggling. Our staff is struggling. We are so tired from doing this work, and we also get so much. And for us to disrupt the power of a flow from the global north to the global south, Millie Thayer has this beautiful work on translations and refusals. And I think it's important for us to disrupt the idea that we are separate. We are not separate, and we get something. The fact that we get to be in a funding space means that we get to learn from and be in conversation with people whose work is inspiring, is giving us hope, and is something that gives us a sense of meaning. So I guess I would just close with a sense of having shared humanity and factoring ourselves into the movements. We are a part of the movement, humbly, and we are also getting something from being in the work of giving.
Thank you. You have all woven a wonderful tapestry of wisdom, supported by great questions and commentary from our audience. And just thank you for the panel, and thank you to the panelists.